Kongsberg Software, Toshiba's iron. While that request slipped through export paperwork, two engineering cultures were about to meet. One built giant, unmoving iron. The other wrote code that made motion feel like thought. Toshiba Machines, MBP 110, was the kind of hardware you only appreciate when you stand under it. 2 stories tall, hundreds of thousands of kilograms of cast rigidity. A spindle that didn't flinch when a multi-ton bronze blank fought back. Across the continent, Kongsberg Wapenfabrik had spent years teaching steel and silicon to obey split-second commands. Missile guidance, numerical control, timing that didn't drift. What nobody outside that world appreciates is how much quiet lives inside math. Simultaneous multi-axis interpolation isn't a brochure phrase. It's the difference between a cutter gliding and a cutter stumbling. Think of a blade surface as a moving target in 5, 6, 9 coordinated directions. Tilt, rotate, sweep, rise, feed, all at once. If one axis lags even a fraction, the tool digs a microstep at a curvature change. That step becomes a pressure edge. That pressure edge becomes a tonal line. Kongsberg's code solved those lags, predicting where the tool had to be and driving every servo like a string section, staying with a conductor's baton. Pair that with the MBP 110 stiffness, and you get geometry that holds. Soviet prop blanks were enormous, and under a lesser machine, the whole setup breathes when the cutter bites. Microns of flex at the hub, a whisper of tilt at full span. On a spectrogram, that flex becomes music. Toshiba's frame crushed that movement into silence. The spindle bearings refused to chatter. The slideways didn't squirm when the head changed direction. You could command a path, and this is the key. The tool would actually follow it in real time, through compound curves, without the tiny stalls that leave acoustic fingerprints. Paper trail hid the essence. On end-use forms, the Toshiba MBP 110 was a computerized milling machine for marine components. The control units read like any industrial CNC. Nowhere did a box say Submarine Stealth. The real tells lived in metadata, axis counts, interpolation granularity, look-ahead depth in the motion planner, servo loop bandwidth. Kongsberg's controller didn't just step from one coordinate to the next. It looked ahead, blended moves, and compensated for machine dynamics so the cutter pressure stayed even. Even pressure equals even surface equals even pressure in water. That's quiet. Inside the Soviet yard, the change sounded like absence. A finishing pass across the hub blade fillet used to sing tiny, regular squeals from a controller approximating a curve with little flats. With Kongsberg's algorithms, the squeal fell away. The operator watched spindle load stay flat where it used to pulse. The deviation map, measuring how far the real surface strayed from the math, shrunk into the noise of the probe. 6 blades cut from one program came out as siblings, not cousins. When they were mounted, their phase matched within hairs. Phase match kills chorus effects. The prop hums less because every blade shares the same truth. Here's where the ocean met software, and where Kongsberg's simultaneous multi-axis interpolation became acoustic strategy. In water, pressure changes love regularity. If your controller leaves systematic dwell marks at specific curvature transitions, those become repeatable, countable signals. If your interpolation smooths those transitions into continuous motion, you smear those signals into nothing a passive array can lock onto. Kongsberg's simultaneous multi-axis interpolation didn't just make machining prettier, it erased periodicity. Toshiba's iron kept that erasure honest by not flexing under load. Together, they produced blades that delayed cavitation by knots and scrubbed the telltale tonals that had anchored Western tracking. The procurement side understood deniability. Contract language bent toward civilian needs. Shipments came in pieces. Drive units here, controller racks there, software updates tucked inside innocuous maintenance kits. When questions came, answers leaned into ambiguity. A 9-axis capable platform can also make turbines, pumps, big impellers for power utilities. That part was true. Dual use was the cover. The intent sat in the way. The controller shipped with interpolation options tuned for large, skewed surfaces, and in the training materials that focused on blade chord transitions and tip radii. Engineers in Leningrad passed around new G-code that looked like poetry compared to the old stuff. Long, smooth command strings without the staccato of point-to-point hacks. The controller's look-ahead function, reading thousands of moves in advance, kept speeds and feeds coherent through the nastiest geometry. You didn't have to slow down at the worst blend to avoid gouging. The machine handled it. That matters for heat and microstructure as well as shape. A cooler, steadier cut leaves a surface that doesn't need aggressive post-polish, preserving the exact curvature the designer wanted. Meanwhile, the US side still read CNC mill and thought in categories, not consequences. A 5-axis label sounded blocked by COCOM. A clever description and split shipments slid the MBP 110 past suspicion. And software. In the 198s, code wasn't policed like steel. A controller with advanced interpolation didn't raise eyebrows unless someone in the room understood what simultaneous meant to a pressure field 50 feet below a hull. At sea, months later, the absence had a rhythm of its own. Fewer tonals, thinner harmonics, a broadband floor that felt lower. The Akula's new props weren't magic. They were the math finally enforced by a machine that didn't argue and a controller that didn't blink. The combination shortened the US advantage from minutes to seconds, from ranges measured in oceans to ranges that demanded better water, better placement, better luck. And luck is not a strategy. Budgets would later count the bill in the tens of billions, with some tallies cresting toward $100 billion across programs. The export gatekeepers and how they blinked. While the spindles were being bolted down in Leningrad, the story on our side of the line looked boring: forms, acronyms, and meetings where nobody raised their voice. COCOM was supposed to be the dam. Allied countries agreed. High-end machine tools and control systems that could shift the military balance didn't cross into the Soviet bloc. Lists spelled out restricted categories. End-use checks were the ritual. You wrote where it was going, what it would do, who would own it. On paper, the system was tight. But dual-use brake systems, a machine that can carve a submarine prop, can also make turbines, pumps, heavy impellers for civilian power utilities. Toshiba's MBP 110 sat right on that seam, classified by capability, described by intent. The words on the form were everything: computerized milling machines, marine components, improving the electric power utility. Put that next to a model number that, to most gatekeepers, was just another alphanumeric code, and you're halfway across the river. Hear how the seams widened. Approvals didn't land on one desk, they scattered. The base MBP 110 machine was one decision. The Kongsberg control rack and software were another. Training packages a third. Spare parts a fourth. A trading house in between wrote the cover letters. A shell buyer fronted the end-use statement. Each shipment looked harmless by itself, and the timing never lined up in a way that screamed submarines. When a reviewer asked for a site visit, the answers came back reasonable. Big yard, mixed work, pressure to modernize. Everyone nodded and moved on. The paperwork spoke a careful dialect. Axis counts softened into phrases like multi-axis capability. Interpolation options were advanced path planning. Servo bandwidth became responsive motion control. If someone in a ministry didn't live inside machining, those terms washed over them. Meanwhile, the real tells hid in configuration sheets that never passed a curious eye. Simultaneous multi-axis interpolation enabled. Look-ahead length set high. Smoothing filters tuned for large, twisted surfaces. The Kongsberg controller shipped with exactly the features a prop shop needed to erase periodicity, but the labels stayed generic. Bureaucracy likes categories. A 5-axis machine with certain specs tripped alarms. A 9-axis capable platform described as configurable for industrial roles didn't fit the template, and the shipping cadence blurred intent. A base MBP 110 frame left Japan. Months later, a controller with nondescript part numbers followed. Then a maintenance kit with what looked like firmware updates and calibration routines. A training team visited to teach complex contouring. The total picture was a submarine prop factory. The snapshots were just modernization. There were warnings, memos from analysts who'd watched Soviet procurement patterns for years. They flagged the combination. Large format MBP-110 class mills plus Kongsberg advanced controllers routed to yards known for naval work. They underline the language drift in end-use forms, the sudden appetite for simultaneous interpolation. But the process wasn't built to add weak signals across agencies. Each office saw its slice and weighed risk against trade. Japan's MITI heard industry pressure. Norway's oversight heard a familiar customer in a grey zone. In Washington, COCOM files stacked up, and the habit was to trust allies' internal policing. Facilitators did their job. Trading houses polished the story. Shell buyers laundered destinations through intermediaries that sounded less military. Documentation avoided model numbers when possible, leaning on descriptions that sounded benign. Someone signed a letter saying the machines would support marine components and civil energy infrastructure. Nobody wrote Akula. Nobody wrote skewed propellers. The metadata, the only place where intent breathed, stayed inside controller menus and calibration files. Timeline mattered, too. The early 198s were a messy period for export control culture. Personal computers were exploding, numerical control was spreading, and the idea that software itself could be the weapon hadn't sunk in. COCOM lists were better at blocking obvious steal than subtle code. Inspectors could count axes on a spec sheet. They were less ready to ask how those axes were driven under load through compound curves. Software update didn't light up the board like new missile. The system lagged the frontier. Auditors signed off. They checked serials against lists, confirmed invoices matched shipments, logged site addresses that had plausible reasons to own heavy mills. A few asked about end-use again, got the same answers, and accepted them. The incentive structure leaned toward approval unless a denial was clean and defensible. Risk was diffuse. Responsibility was shared. No one person saw a prop shop being born out of parts. Meanwhile, the crates left the docks. In Leningrad and other yards, riggers craned MBP-110 frames into place and leveled them to within hairs. Kongsberg racks slid into cabinets, fans humming as controllers woke up. Field engineers ran calibration routines, teaching the machines their own flex so the code could cancel it out. The first training cycles cut test pieces with sweeps and fillets no domestic mill could hold. A machinist leaned in, listened for chatter, and heard quiet. Back in the offices, the file folders closed. Stamps went down. Compliance boxes were ticked. Everyone had done their part by the book. What nobody knew at the time was that the book had missed the point. The ocean doesn't care whether a controller's interpolation lives under civilian on a form. It cares about pressure changing smoothly over a blade. And across the world, the spindles began to sing a song that Sonar wouldn't hear. The day the library went quiet. It started as a feeling. A watch team in the North Atlantic rode a thermal, quiet as they could make themselves, and waited for the usual forest of lines to rise on the waterfall. The queue was solid, an outbound patrol that last year would have painted the screen with blade rate, overtones, and a steady shaft wobble. What came up instead was thin, a few hesitant tonals, a floor that felt lower than it should. The log recorded it like weather, anomalous faint signature, and the boat slid on. Across an ocean, a Todere crew dragged coils through water where the library said a Victor series should roar. The operator leaned into the headphones, narrowed the filter, and watched a faint line wobble where a strong beat should hammer. He called the supervisor, they tuned beamformers, they waited for the harmonics to stack. They didn't. The paper afterward read like a shrug. Probable contact, low confidence, environment likely factor. You don't throw out 3 decades of patterns because one night feels off. Then it happened again. A P3 crew over the GIUK gap laid a string of buoys across a lane they'd used for years. The sonar boys whispered back almost nothing. The crew chief thought a buoy failed, then 2. They reseeded the field, the same near silence. The debrief spiraled through oceanography, temperature layers, surface conditions, shipping clutter. Somebody cracked a joke about gremlins. Back home, analysts pulled the tapes and looked for buried lines. The noise floor was real. It sat below where the book said it should. Meanwhile, a Lowe's Angels-class boat, weeks later, picked up a contact that felt like a shadow. A soft, regular pulse hinting at blade count, then slipping under flow noise. The skipper ordered a slow speed change to shift self-noise out of the way. The line firmed for seconds, then dissolved. In the control room, nobody said it out loud, but the thought surfaced. If this is a new normal, we're flying blind. In the message sent after, the words were careful. Signature mismatch. Low tonal presentation, inconsistent with catalogued class. Back at the centers, analysts lined up cases on long tables. SOSUS hits that should have queued planes didn't. Trails that used to last hours vanished in minutes. Engineers checked the arrays. The gear worked. They pulled environmental data. Nothing explained a pattern that stretched across basins. A quiet memo compared yard output dates with detections and found an overlap that nobody liked. Boats from yards recently modernized were hardest to hear. The Akula name crept into sentences with qualifiers, emerging class provisional signature, and then the qualifiers fell away. A micro-story traveled through the community. A SOSUS watchstander on a midnight shift logged a non-event that should have been a raw, exact transit time, route all per past behavior. He went home annoyed, certain he'd missed something. Weeks later, when other stations reported the same thing at the same routes, he pulled his sheet and stared at the blank where a bell should have rung. Training had taught him to trust patterns. Now the pattern was the blank. Inside the labs, narrowband displays looked naked. The old props had painted with heavy brushes, strong blade rate, overtones stacked like rungs, a shaft-related tone beating steady. What scrolled across now was a cleaner spectrum, tonals faint, harmonics thin, broadband shaved down. Analysts hunted for machinery modulation, tiny ripples from pumps and generators, and found hints, not hooks. A few caught a breath of a transient when a target crossed a layer, a faint sigh that gave them a course and speed for a minute. Then it was gone. The arguments got sharp. One camp clung to oceanography, layered water, shipping masking, seasonal effects. Another camp pointed at metal. "You don't lose harmonics like that unless the blade is different," one said in a room that didn't like certainties. They dug into residuals, measuring the spacing between what little remained of the lines. The math said the blade count hadn't changed. The purity had. Pressure pulses were smoother. Cavitation onset had moved right, more speed before the bubbles sang. Then came the pattern that broke the debate. Multiple areas, Atlantic lanes, Pacific approaches, reported near-identical quiet against units that intelligence said were fresh out of specific yards. The dates lined up too clean to ignore. A senior analyst wrote it in one sentence. "We are seeing a step change in acoustic presentation consistent with improved propeller geometry and surface finish." Someone added a note in the margin. "Large multiple reduction claims are aggressive but consistent with delayed cavitation and suppressed tonals." From the boats, the human cost peeked through careful prose. Contact lost without clear cause. Reacquisition unsuccessful despite optimal positioning. Recommend increased aviation support. Commanders widened search boxes. ASW aircraft burned more flight hours trying to fill in gaps that Sonar used to cover. Watchstanders who'd prided themselves on calling class from a heartbeat had to sit with unknown, probable SSN. The confidence that used to ride in the room, born of a library built over 30 years, thinned. In the aftermath of those first months, the briefings changed tone. Screens showed before and after spectrograms, old Soviet songs dense with lines, new passes washed clean. A red overlay marked where the library expected peaks, and a blue overlay marked where reality put them, lower, fainter, sometimes absent. The word parity edged into slides about passive advantage. Nobody liked it. Everybody felt it. And in a quiet corner, a team underlined a sentence they'd been building toward. If props got this clean, the answer isn't louder ears, it's different listening. The day the library went quiet wasn't one day. It was a season of absences, threaded together by crews who knew exactly what should have been there. The revelation wasn't that the ocean had changed. It was that the metal had, with help from machines and code that never should have cut those blades. Inside the prop shop, tolerances, skew, and cavitation. To get why the ocean stopped singing, walk into the prop shop where silence was cut into metal. A bronze blank the size of a small house sits under a gantry. The Toshiba MBP 110 wakes with a low hum. Its head tilts, rotates, advances. 9-axis escapable choreography mapped by Kongsberg's simultaneous multi-axis interpolation. The cutter doesn't jab and pause, it glides. Every motion is blended, every transition smoothed before it happens. That's not poetry. That's pressure control by geometry, enforced in steel. Start at the blade root, where it meets the hub. Old tools stumbled there. You'd see faint steps, tiny flats where a curve should have been. Those steps shed vortices at steady intervals, and Sonar loved them. With the new controller's look ahead and high bandwidth servos, the path stays continuous. No dwell marks, no micro edges. The fillet becomes a true blend, so the pressure change across it doesn't wink on and off. One repeating tonal just died before the blade even left the machine. Now ride the cutter out along the chord. Skew is the trick that bends pressure waves out of sync so they don't stack into a shout. But skew only works if the surface follows the math everywhere, not just most places. The MBP 110's rigidity matters here. Under load, lesser frames breathe, a whisper of flex that fattens or thins the cut by microns at full span. On a printout, that's nothing. In water, that's a line on someone's screen. With the MBP 110 bolted down, the spindle stays put when the tool bites. The control brain predicts the machine's tiny deflections and cancels them as it moves. You order a curvature, the metal obeys. Then the surface itself. Finish isn't shine for photos, it's the last word in flow. A rough pass leaves miniature ridges that act like speed bumps for water, feeding broadband hiss. The Kongsberg-controlled finish pass, steady load, no chatter, lays down a micro-texture that's uniform, not mirror slick, not orange peel. Uniform. Uniform texture means uniform boundary layer, which means fewer random eddies whispering in microphones miles away. You don't polish your way to that. You cut it into existence. Tolerances stopped being averages and became everywhere. In the old shop, you could be within spec in most places and still sing. One blade tip could end up a hair heavier, another a hair thin. Mount them around the hub and phase mismatch turns the prop into a chorus. With the new code, 6 blades come off the table with deviations buried in probe noise. They're not similar, they're matched. Mount them, index them, and the phase lines up so clean you kill chorus effects before the shaft ever spins. Cavitation is the hard ceiling for silence, the speed where microbubbles burst into applause. You don't avoid it forever, but you can shove that onset right. 2 things push it. Pressure distribution you can trust across the whole radius, and a tip that doesn't knife the water. The simultaneous interpolation earns its keep at the tip, where curvature flips quick and bad controllers hesitate. That hesitation used to leave a faint ledge, a seed for early cavitation. Now the tip geometry holds, the edge stays honest, and the first bubbles form knots later. That's speed the target keeps without waking the ocean. In the bay, a machinist leans in during a finishing pass. He used to brace for the squeal when the head crossed the hub blade blend. Today it stays quiet. Spindle load doesn't pulse. The gauge map afterward looks boring, colors tight, no sudden spikes at the usual trouble spots. He runs his glove along the fillet anyway, a habit older than the code, and feels nothing but a continuous curve. He doesn't need to fix it with a hand stone. The program held. The inspector checks the deviations against the design. Sub-millimeter everywhere, often sub-tenth. He circles the tip radii, the chord thickness at stations that used to be lies told to paper. The numbers repeat across blades like a stamp. When they hang all 6 on the hub, the run-out dial barely twitches. Phase match, thickness match, radius match. The shop doesn't celebrate. It calibrates the next job, downloads a controller patch, and tightens something nobody will see. Meanwhile, the designers back at the bureau finally hear their math in steel. They'd always known what would happen if the pressure pulses smoothed and cavitation slipped. Tonals thin, harmonics lose energy, broadband drops, the blade rate line, the heartbeat sonar text counted, fades under flow noise. In the water, the wake carries less hint of a regular beat. A US array listening 100 miles away gets a softer picture, enough to tease, not enough to pin. That shift forced the hunters to chase what remained. Hull flow, machinery modulation, odd transients when a boat crosses a layer. But those cues live in seconds, not minutes, and they're stingy. The prop shop didn't invent stealth. It enforced it at scale. The MBP-110's stiffness, Kongsberg's interpolation, matched sets, smoother tips, each a fraction, each a fix, added up to a blade that stopped singing and started breathing. And once that breath got into the ocean, the library went from certain to guessing in a season. The intel unraveling, follow the paper, follow the ships. While operators wrestled with silence at sea, analysts chased noise on land, serials, invoices, and whispers that didn't fit. The first clue wasn't grand. A maintenance log in an Allied channel listed a controller firmware update with interpolation parameters nobody in that region should have needed. It referenced simultaneous multi-axis routines optimized for skewed large-diameter rotors. The part number traced to Kongsberg. The destination, a yard that on public maps built marine components, the same yard later linked to Akula outputs. Meanwhile, shipping records turned up a giant. MBP-110 frames routed through trading houses with bland names, parts split into separate consignments months apart. A crate marked machine bed in 1982, a precision spindle in 1983, controller racks in 1984. Each shipment looked legal in isolation. Together they spelled out a prop factory. The cover letters leaned on the same phrasing: civilian utilities, power generation, marine applications, never submarine. Analysts pinned each waypoint to a wall map and saw the pattern: Baltic shipyard first, then sister yards. Humint shaded the picture. A contact in Leningrad described foreign engineers teaching the machines to anticipate curves. An odd way to talk about a mill until you heard anticipate again from another source in Severodvinsk. Across channels, procurement officers started ordering metrology gear, laser trackers, surface probes, good enough to verify sub-millimeter tolerances on twisted geometry. Those instruments weren't window dressing. They were the only way to prove blades were truly matched. The orders landed within months of the quiet patrols. Tech teams went hunting for prop geometries in imagery. You don't see a blade's finish from a satellite, but you can estimate skew, pitch distribution, and tip planform from launch photos and yard-side shots. The new screws showed tighter, more aggressive skew, with chord thickness that read as uniform along stations where older props had obvious bulges. Engineers ran hydrodynamic models and spat out expected pressure fields. The predicted acoustic output fell right where the tapes were getting thin. Then came the serials. A maintenance note from an Eastern European intermediary listed a Kongsberg controller board number that matched a batch sold to Toshiba's export arm in the early 198s. The invoice line called it industrial motion control. The configuration sheet tucked inside was less shy. Simultaneous multi-axis interpolation enabled. Look-ahead depth expanded. Smoothing filters tuned for large radius compound curves. No one wrote Akula, but the math screamed it.